This incident happened to an ambulance driver I know. For obvious reasons, I am not revealing his real name or identity. Let us call him Khalil. I am going to tell the incident exactly the way Khalil Chacha himself told my father. Khalil said, "That night was different from all the other nights. It was what you would call torrential rain. It was around 10 or perhaps 10:30 at night. Darkness had completely engulfed everything around me. On top of that, the rain was pouring down relentlessly. Even the headlights of the ambulance seemed to be losing the battle against the fury of nature. I had been working as an ambulance driver for nearly 10 years. During all those years, I had driven through countless nights, carrying all kinds of patients and even dead bodies from one end of the city to another. But I had never experienced anything like what happened that night. My destination was somewhere on the other side of the city, a little farther inside the area. According to the address I had been given, I was supposed to deliver a dead body. There was no one else with me. It was just me and the lifeless body lying in the rear cabin. The roads were completely deserted. Apart from one or two stray dogs, there was no sign of life anywhere. Perhaps because of the heavy rain, everyone had taken shelter inside their homes early. The only thing I could rely on while driving was the faint beam of the ambulance's headlights cutting through the heavy sheets of rain. The constant sound of the engine blended with the rhythmic sound of the pouring rain. Everything around me had become one strange, continuous noise. Altogether, the atmosphere felt unusually tense and eerie. As soon as the ambulance left the main road and entered a narrower road, my discomfort began to grow. I was not very familiar with this road. There were hardly any houses around either. On both sides, there were only large trees. With the rain pouring down on them, they looked even darker and more frightening. Inside the ambulance, it suddenly felt strangely cold. Although, on a rainy night like that, the air should have felt humid and stuffy. I checked the AC. It was definitely turned off. Then where was this cold feeling coming from? A shiver ran down my shoulder. Without even realizing it, I glanced toward the back. In the rearview mirror, I could see the faint reflection of the back cabin. The body covered with a white sheet was lying there completely still. I tried to reassure myself. Maybe it only felt this way because of the rain. After driving for a while, I suddenly heard a strange sound coming from the rear cabin. It sounded like a faint groan. At first, I paid no attention to it. I thought perhaps it was the sound of the wind or some mechanical part of the ambulance. But a few moments later, I heard the same sound again. This time it was clearer. It sounded as if someone was groaning in extreme pain. My heart suddenly skipped a beat. I knew there was absolutely no possibility of the person lying behind me making that sound. The doctor at the hospital had personally examined the body and issued the death certificate. Then who was making that sound? I slowed the ambulance down a little. I listened carefully, waiting to hear it again. For a few seconds, there was complete silence. Then, once again, this time, the groaning sound seemed to come from much closer, almost right beside my ear. I suddenly turned to look beside me. There was no one there. Then was I imagining it? Could this be happening because I was extremely tired? It had been a long and exhausting day. Maybe that was the reason. I turned my attention back to the steering wheel, but I could not get that sound out of my mind. After a while, the groaning stopped, but something new began. This time, it sounded as if someone was scratching at the door of the rear cabin. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound continued relentlessly. It was even more disturbing than the groaning. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Now I was almost certain that I was not imagining it. Something was happening in the back. But what exactly was happening? I didn't have the courage to think about it. Once again, I looked at the rearview mirror. The body covered with the white sheet was still lying exactly as before. But for some reason, I suddenly felt that the sheet was slightly higher than it had been moments ago, as if someone underneath it was trying to get up. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself down. When you work in this line of work, you have to keep your nerves strong. We have to witness all kinds of scenes. But this was not just another scene. This felt alive. The scratching sound kept getting louder, and now another sound joined it. This time, it sounded as if someone was banging their head against the inner wall. Thud, 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 a heavy, dull sound. My hands and feet started to go cold. Sweat from my forehead mixed with the rainwater and rolled down my cheeks. I decided to stop the ambulance and take a look at the back. But the very next moment, I wondered, would it really be a good idea to stop the vehicle on this deserted, pitch-black road? What if something truly abnormal was happening? What could I possibly do alone? Even if I screamed for help, there was no one around who could hear me. Besides, it was my responsibility to deliver the body safely to its relatives. Stopping the ambulance and wasting time in this situation would be foolish. I increased the speed of the ambulance. I thought that the sooner I reached my destination, the sooner I could escape from this disturbing situation. But as soon as I increased the speed, the strange things happening in the back seemed to intensify as well. The sound of the head banging became even louder. Then another strange sound joined it. A deep, muffled groaning sound, as if someone's breathing was becoming strained. I felt that whatever was in the back was no longer lying still. It was moving. Perhaps it was trying to sit up. The moment that thought entered my mind, the hair on my body stood on end. I no longer had the courage to look behind me. I kept my eyes fixed on the road and simply continued driving. The intensity of the rain seemed to increase as well. The windshield wipers could barely keep up anymore. The road ahead was almost impossible to see clearly. In the headlights, all I could see were the electricity poles disappearing one after another behind me. I felt as though this road would never end, as if I had been driving forever through a rainy night, carrying something evil behind me. Suddenly, the scratching sound, the head banging, the groaning, everything stopped at once. An eerie silence descended inside the ambulance. It was so quiet that I could hear the sound of my own heartbeat. That sudden silence was somehow even more frightening. It felt like everything had become calm just before a storm. Something was about to happen. Something very bad. I gripped the steering wheel even tighter. I looked at the clock. It was almost 11 p.m. I still had at least another 30 minutes before reaching my destination. How was I going to get through those 30 minutes? My throat went dry just thinking about it. I silently called upon the Creator, praying that He would save me from this danger. But I didn't know that the real incident had only just begun. The sudden silence that had come after all that terrifying activity brought me no relief. Instead, it made the fear several times worse. I felt that perhaps the evil thing behind me had been making its presence known all this time. But now it was preparing to do something directly. I gripped the steering wheel even tighter. My sweaty hands were slipping. The rain had not weakened even slightly. Every now and then, lightning flashed. And in those brief flashes of light, the terrifying surroundings became even more visible. After driving for a while in complete silence, another strange disturbance began. The lights inside the ambulance suddenly started flickering. On, then off, then on again. This constant play of light and darkness was putting tremendous pressure on my nerves. I looked at the dashboard. There were no warning lights showing. There shouldn't have been any problem with the vehicle's electrical system. The entire ambulance had been serviced only a week earlier. Then why were the lights behaving like this? Amid the flickering lights, I looked into the rearview mirror, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The body covered with the white sheet, which had remained completely still until then, was now moving slightly. One corner of the sheet slowly lifted upward, and then came back down, as if someone underneath the sheet was breathing. But that was impossible. I couldn't believe my own eyes. Maybe the flickering lights were playing tricks on my vision. I blinked several times and looked again. No, it wasn't my imagination. The sheet was really moving. My throat went completely dry. Who was that? What was it doing on this deserted road in the middle of a stormy night? I thought about honking the horn and telling whoever it was to move away. But my hands seemed to have gone completely numb. The man didn't move an inch. He remained standing there in exactly the same position with his head lowered. After a few moments, the man slowly raised his head. And the moment I saw his face, I screamed. There were no eyes, no nose, and no mouth on his face. His entire face looked completely smooth, as if it were covered by a layer of skin. But somehow, I could feel that he was looking directly at me. He was sensing my presence through the eyes he didn't have. I was in a terrible state. Somehow, I remained in the driver's seat and locked the door. My hands and legs were trembling. I rested my head against the steering wheel and closed my eyes. I had no idea what I was supposed to do. This terrifying thing was standing directly in front of my ambulance. I couldn't move forward. I couldn't go backward either. I felt as if I were trapped in a deadly trap. At that exact moment, I heard the sound of the rear door of the ambulance opening, that familiar creaking sound. I suddenly looked at the rearview mirror. The door of the rear cabin was open, and from there, a shadow was slowly coming down. My entire body went numb. I lost the ability to move. I could only stare at the mirror. The shadow stepped down from the ambulance and slowly began moving toward the door beside my driver's seat. I looked toward the side window. Because of the rainwater covering the glass, I couldn't see clearly outside. But I could tell that someone was standing directly outside the door. A few seconds later, I heard a knocking sound against the door. Knock, knock, knock. Soft but unmistakably clear. I felt as though I was about to lose consciousness. But before that could happen, I noticed something. The layer of rainwater covering the window beside me was slowly moving away, as if someone outside was wiping the glass. And then I saw the most terrifying sight of my life. On the other side of the window, that same eyeless, noseless, mouthless face was staring directly at me. Its horrifying, featureless face was almost pressed against the glass. I could no longer control myself. A terrifying scream burst out of my mouth. I closed my eyes. I felt as though this was the final moment of my life. But nothing happened. After a while, I slowly opened my eyes. There was no one outside. Everything was quiet again, just as it had been before. With trembling hands, I checked the door lock. It was still locked. I realized that these things were trying to frighten me. They wanted to weaken me mentally. But why? What was their purpose? I didn't know. I only knew that I had to get out of there. As soon as that thought entered my mind, an unusual determination took hold of me. I decided that whatever happened, I would not be afraid anymore. I switched the headlights on again, and surprisingly, both headlights came on. It was almost as if my courage had been tested all this time. I didn't waste another second. I pressed the accelerator with all my strength. The engine roared as the ambulance shot forward at tremendous speed. I didn't look ahead for long. I didn't have the courage to find out whether that faceless figure was still standing there. I simply kept driving along the road. As fast as I could, I tried to get out of that cursed area. Every moment felt like an entire lifetime, and I had no idea where this night would end. After leaving that faceless figure behind, I thought perhaps I had already survived the most terrifying part. But I had no idea how wrong I was. It didn't take long for me to realize that. Once the headlights came back on and I started driving the ambulance at full speed, the fear inside me had decreased somewhat. A stubborn determination had taken over. No matter what happened, I had to tear through the darkness of this night and reach my destination. But that sense of relief was extremely short-lived. Just when the ambulance had started moving at a steady speed again, I noticed that the inside of the ambulance had suddenly become strangely heavy. The pressure in the air felt unusually intense. I was having difficulty even breathing. It felt as though someone was sitting heavily on my chest. Then something else joined it. A rotten smell. An extremely foul, unbearable stench. It smelled like something that had been submerged in water and left to rot for a long time. The smell was so strong that I felt like vomiting. But somehow I managed to control myself. I could understand that those evil things had not left me yet. Perhaps they had changed their form, but their presence was making itself known even more strongly than before. I opened all the windows of the ambulance slightly so that some fresh air from outside could enter. But even that did not reduce the smell. Instead, as the outside air entered the ambulance, the stench seemed to mix with it and become even stronger, hitting my nose with an unbearable intensity. Amid this unbearable situation, I looked into the rearview mirror. The rear cabin was dark, but my sixth sense was telling me that something was there. I could see a shadow lying over the empty stretcher. At first, I thought it might be a reflection of some light from outside. But the very next moment, I realized I was wrong. The shadow was moving. Slowly, it began to become denser. It was trying to take a shape. My heartbeat grew faster. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Right before my eyes, the shadow slowly transformed into a figure. The figure was sitting on the stretcher. Its legs were hanging down. It was wearing the same white sheet that had been covering the dead body. The sheet covered its entire body. Only its legs were visible. Two pale, swollen-looking feet. I was almost frozen with fear. This was the same dead body. But it had been dead. Then how had it suddenly sat up? It felt as though the cells in my brain had stopped working. Was I dreaming? Or was I losing my mind? While I was struggling with these thoughts, the figure slowly turned its head toward me. I couldn't see its face through the sheet, but I could feel it. It was looking directly at me. What happened next was something I was completely unprepared for. The figure brought one of its hands out from underneath the sheet. Long, thin, pale fingers. With those fingers, it gestured toward me, as if it wanted something from me. I was so terrified that my hands almost slipped off the steering wheel. The ambulance began drifting toward one side of the road. Somehow, I managed to bring it back under control. My eyes were still fixed on the rearview mirror. I had absolutely no idea what to do. No sane person could possibly keep their head straight in a situation like this. The figure continued gesturing toward me. The movement of its fingers was slow and steady. After a while, it stopped gesturing. This time, it grabbed the wall of the rear cabin with one hand. Then, slowly, it began trying to climb down from the stretcher. I felt that it was coming toward me. The moment that thought entered my mind, my entire body seemed to go numb. I knew that if it reached me even once, there would be no way for me to survive. I became desperate. At the final moment, people do whatever they can to survive. I did the same. Instead of slowing down, I increased the speed of the ambulance even more. There was only one thought in my mind. Somehow, I had to get out of this ambulance. I even thought about opening the door and jumping out while the vehicle was still moving. But the very next moment, I realized that jumping out at this speed would almost certainly kill me. Just then, an idea came to my mind. I grabbed my mobile phone from the dashboard. There was no network, so I couldn't call anyone. I switched on the flashlight on my phone. Then I pointed it toward the rearview mirror so that the beam of light would shine directly into the rear cabin. The moment the light fell inside the cabin, a terrifying scream came from the back. It wasn't a human voice, but it wasn't an animal either. It was a horrifying scream that sounded like a mixture of both. The intensity of the scream was so powerful that I felt as though my eardrums were about to burst. I saw the figure begin to writhe the moment the light touched it. It tried to cover itself with its hands. I realized that the light was my only weapon. I kept the flashlight pointed toward the mirror. The figure was writhing in agony. Its entire body was trembling. And slowly, it began turning back into a shadow. Within a few moments, that dense shadow completely disappeared, as if there had never been anything there. The rear cabin became empty again, just as it had been before. The terrible rotten smell was gone too. I was gasping for breath. My entire body was soaked in sweat. I didn't turn off the flashlight. I kept it pointed toward the mirror. I didn't know whether that thing would return again. But for the moment, I felt a little relieved. I turned my attention back to driving. My destination was not very far away anymore. Looking at the milestone beside the road, I realized that I had no more than 10 or 15 minutes left. I had to survive those few minutes somehow. There was only one prayer in my mind. Please let no new danger come. But I knew this night would not end so easily. Perhaps the real test was still waiting for me. After watching the figure in the rear cabin disappear in the light of my phone's flashlight, I thought that perhaps it wouldn't be long before this terrifying night finally came to an end. The mobile phone in my hand had become my only source of hope. I held the steering wheel with one hand and kept the phone pointed toward the rearview mirror with the other as I continued driving. All my attention was divided between the road and the mirror. Only a few kilometers remained before I reached my destination. My heart still felt as though it might burst out of my chest. But somewhere inside my mind, a small ray of hope had begun to glow. Perhaps I would finally make it out of this nightmare. The intensity of the rain had decreased somewhat. It was now falling as a light drizzle. I was looking at the signs along the road, trying to match them with the address I had been given. Finally, I found the narrow lane I was looking for. It was an old neighborhood. The roads were quite narrow. It was difficult to get the ambulance through. All the houses around me were completely dark. Felt like an abandoned area. Not a single light was on anywhere. It didn't take me long to find the house according to the address. It was an old 2-story house. Moss had grown all over its walls. Just by looking at it, I could tell that the house was very old. I stopped the ambulance in front of the house. Before turning off the engine, I looked into the rearview mirror one last time. The rear cabin was empty. There was nothing unusual to be seen. I let out a sigh of relief and turned off the engine. Before getting out of the ambulance, I waited for a few moments. I listened carefully, trying to hear whether there was any unusual sound. Nothing. Everything was completely silent. Apart from the chirping of crickets and the gentle sound of raindrops, there was nothing else to be heard. I gathered my courage and stepped out of the ambulance. The gate of the house was closed. I walked toward it and looked for a doorbell, but I couldn't find one. Perhaps there wasn't any. I knocked on the gate several times. There was no response from inside. I was a little surprised. I had brought a dead body to the house, yet no one seemed to be awake. That didn't make sense. I took the piece of paper with the address written on it out of my pocket and checked it again. The address was correct. This time I knocked harder and shouted, "I'm from the ambulance. I've brought the body." My voice echoed through the silent night and came back to me. After calling out several times, I heard footsteps from inside. Someone was approaching the door. A few moments later, I heard the creaking sound of the main door opening. An elderly man was standing there, holding a lantern in his hand. There was a deep expression of sorrow on his face. When he saw me, he said, "Please come inside." I said, "I've brought the body. If you receive it, I can unload it." The man let out a long sigh and said, "Please wait a moment. I'll call the others." Saying that, he went back inside. I remained standing outside the gate. For some reason, the place made me extremely uncomfortable. There was no sound of anyone crying from inside the house. No commotion. Everything was strangely, unnaturally quiet. After a while, the elderly man returned with 2 or 3 other people. Their faces were all grim. Without saying anything to me, they opened the rear door of the ambulance. I stepped forward to help them. Together, we pulled the stretcher out. But the moment the stretcher came out, we were all shocked. The body lying on the stretcher was covered with a white sheet. But one part of the sheet was soaked in blood. And right where the sheet was wet, there was a small tear. The people from the house looked at one another. Fear and astonishment were visible in their eyes. The elderly man looked at me and asked in a trembling voice, "How did this happen?" I had no idea what to say. I didn't know how it had happened. I simply said, "When I picked up the body from the hospital, there was nothing like this." After hearing my words, their expressions became even more serious. Without saying anything else, they took hold of the stretcher and began carrying it inside the house. I didn't feel there was any reason for me to go inside with them. My responsibility was finished. I simply told them, "Then I'll leave now." The elderly man turned around and looked at me once. There was something strange in his eyes. He simply nodded. I didn't stay there for another moment. I quickly got back into the ambulance. I turned the vehicle around and drove out of that narrow lane as fast as I could. I had a strong feeling that there was something evil inside that house. But what was the bloodstain? When I finally reached the main road, my phone suddenly rang. It was one of my colleagues calling. As soon as I answered, he asked in a worried voice, "Hey, Khalil, where are you? You were supposed to be back a long time ago." I said, "I'm on my way. I've already delivered the body." What my colleague said next made the ground seem to disappear beneath my feet. He said, "What do you mean you delivered a body? You didn't take any body anywhere tonight. I was on duty tonight. You had taken the night off." I was completely stunned. What was he talking about? I said, "What nonsense are you talking about? I picked up a body from the hospital. I even delivered it to the address I was given." He replied, "No, no body was released from the hospital tonight. Think carefully. Who called you?" My head began spinning. I tried to remember who had called me, but I couldn't remember anything. All I could remember was receiving a phone call and being told to deliver a dead body somewhere. My entire body went cold. Then who had I been carrying around all this time? Who had been inside the back of that ambulance? And the house where I had delivered the body? Whose house was it? I was no longer in a state to understand what was right or wrong. I ended the call. My hands and legs were trembling. I stopped the ambulance on the side of the road. All the events of that night began flashing before my eyes. The groaning sound, the scratching, the strange laughter, the faceless figure, the shadow sitting on the stretcher. Then all of it had been real. I couldn't stay inside the ambulance for another moment. I opened the door and started running. Where I was going or why I was running, I had no idea. I only knew one thing. I had to run away from that ambulance. I had to escape from the horror of that night. After that night, I never drove an ambulance again. But even today, after all these years, whenever I remember that rainy night, the hair on my body stands on end. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I know one thing for certain. It was not an ordinary incident. It was the most terrifying experience of my life.